So we're going to shift gears just a little bit here for the next portion of the presentation, as Avneet has laid out what the consequences are if mankind doesn't get its collective head out of its rear end and look at reality as it is and think about the future in a serious way. We're going to now look at what method of thinking must be adopted if mankind is actually going to not only avoid the consequences of an economic meltdown, of a prolonged war that will lead us into a nuclear confrontation with Russia and China, and thus a dark age, and really look at, well, what is required to go into a renaissance. We're going to begin, after my presentation will lead us into a video followed by a final presentation by David Gosselin. The issue of mind over matter is really the core fight against imperialism historically, as far back as written records go and probably long before. This idea that mankind must be defined simply by his material needs, lusts. This has always been the method by which empires convince the victim populations that they're nothing more than beasts, and thus, since beasts can't govern themselves, they always require a shepherd, some form of dictator, fascism, some elite must necessarily rule the many and keep them in a state of servitude for the benefits of imperialistic traditions. This system is now coming to an end as we're seeing that mankind this century has begun entering a whole new domain of relationship with the universe through the beginning of our harnessing of the atom, of our beginning to look beyond the frontiers of simply the biosphere on the Earth. And this is something that people really have to recognize, because when we often organize the population, our organization, when many of you met us often on the streets. We also organize in Ottawa in various institutions. But a recurring theme that we get as an assumption is either one of these dual aspects of, oh, but it's, you can't change. Yes, the war is inevitable. Wars always are inevitable. They always happen. It's always been this way as far as take anybody between the age of 20 and 80, and it seems that, in the course of their lifespan, wars have been a continuous theme. They've always happened. It'll always be this way. And you've got this idea of this non-changing progression of just bleh, it sucks. It's just brown people have always been starving and killing each other. It's a tragedy, but what are you going to do, Or you've got increasingly, as the crisis is objectively getting worse and worse and more unavoidable, you have this more startling but lawful reaction from another extreme where people very frequently, and it's scary to see how frequent this happens, will say, oh yeah, but it's the end of the world anyway. Right? Whether it's the Christian Fundy flavor, whether it's the Mayan calendar flavor, you take your pick. But this idea that it's the end of the universe because things are just so bad, both are just a cop-out. Both have certain axioms, also common axioms, embedded in this idea that they're just necessary. Money makes the world go round, but so I don't have to do anything. My personal responsibility to changing this process is nil, because even if I tried, I couldn't. So why would I try? So you get this very self-fulfilling prophecy, and it's not organic. Like, there's a lot of work that's gone into corrupting the paradigm of our population from what we had back in LaRouche's generation, when Hitler's minions were being stopped by Franklin Roosevelt's leadership and the population that actually stopped fascism from taking over the world 70 years ago. The moral fabric of society is not just naturally or organically been corrupted just because that's the way human nature is. It's that there has been political operations ongoing within the education, within the media, within the ruling ideologies that are enforced in our culture to bring about the tearing of the fiber to the point that you now have today the most probably gullible few generations in power, each generation being successively a little bit dumber than the one before it. So that you look at what's happening now with these shootings happening across the United States, where there's really not a great sense of empathy with your fellow man, let alone in Africa or even in your own backyard. And the method of thinking that's going to be required by us is located really in this question of the future. how do human beings, unlike animals, relate directly to the deeper past and deeper future as far as we wish to look backward into either direction? We can situate and orient our identity and our priorities in accordance with a context in which animals can't, right? There's a method. This doesn't just come for granted, though. It doesn't just happen like that. You have to think about it and work at it. It's something that has to be earned. And today, in a society where people have been trained to go to Wikipedia to give them answers and memorize for the tests without actually understanding anything that they're getting correct answers on, you don't necessarily have a lot of this capacity. It's taken for granted. So let's look at, I've introduced the idea of the sovereign nation state, this idea of immortality as a theme, and let's use this to see, well, what has the empire been afraid of that these institutions, like of the sovereign nation state, hold? Yes.
Vous savez, là, je vais mettre mon gros commentaire.
Vas-y.
Je vais mettre deux
S'il vous plaît, s'il vous plaît,
gros
vas-y.
sujet.
OK.
Les pays riches et industrialisés, tout ça aussi.
Vas-y.
Tous les problèmes,
OK,
tout ça aussi.
vas-y.
Vous savez, là, l'Europe et les États-Unis, et les deux, l'Europe, le pays le plus riche au monde, ça aussi, et l'Europe, le deuxième continent le plus riche au monde, ça aussi, là, après les États-Unis, là, les pays riches, l'Europe et les États-Unis, qui sont les deux superpuissances économiques, tout ça aussi, qui sont dominés par le capitalisme, tout ça aussi. C'est eux autres qui sont financés par les entreprises, qui sont le capitalisme, tout ça aussi, qui causent les guerres, qui causent les injustices comme ça aussi, puis les affaires comme ça, puis qui tuent les gens, tout ça aussi, qui dégagent dans les pays pauvres comme ça, parce que surtout, les pays riches sont contre les pays pauvres comme ça, parce qu'en cause, les riches sont contre les pauvres, tout ça, c'est eux autres qui causent les injustices.
OK. C'est tout?
Oui,
OK.
c'est tout.
Le point que nous autres on ramène, c'est que, I'll go back to English for a second, but c'est que dans le contexte de la système monétariste, de la mondialisation, où vous avez une petite cartel des banques et des petites familles qui contrôlent les règles de la finance, les États-nations n'existent plus. Si vous conformez à les lois de la mondialisation, vous n'êtes pas une nation souveraine. Ça n'existe pas. D'abord, beaucoup de gens aujourd'hui, ils lancent des condamnations à France comme une nation, à les États-Unis comme une nation ou les Canada comme une nation, et ne réalisent pas qu'il y a une plus haute facteur de contrôle qu'ils ne touchent pas. Et ça, c'est où nous autres on va aujourd'hui. That's what we're going to be going through throughout, I promise. So, let's begin.
Mon dernier commentaire, après ça,
Yeah.
je vous laisse.
Ouais.
Mais après ça, mais ce que je sais, comme on dit, que ce qui est le problème, qu'est-ce qui se passe, où est le problème, tout ça, c'est les pays riches, les États-Unis et l'Europe, les deux continents superpuissances économiques, les pays riches qui causent des injustices, le capitalisme, par le capitalisme comme ça, qui déclenche dans les guerres des injustices dans les pays pauvres, parce que les riches sont contre les pauvres. C'est les États-Unis et l'Europe.
Oui, monsieur, mais je vous entends. Mais ce que je vous dis, c'est que les États-Unis est en train d'être recolonisé par l'Empire britannique qui contrôle Wall Street. Les États-Unis, comme une nation, n'est pas la chose qui décide de rien. Même les citoyens américains sont en train d'être tués par le politique de Wall Street, qui est le politique de la Grande-Bretagne, de Tony Blair, de la reine. That's a thesis. Ça, c'est qu'est-ce que vous allez...
Si on se comprend, c'est peut-être les pays riches qui causent des injustices.
C'est pas une question de riche contre pauvre, c'est pas ça. C'est une question d'idéologie, des idées. Mais laisse-moi continuer.
OK.
Ouais, plutôt, on peut continuer la discussion de ce sujet-là après. Let me begin with somebody very important who said not that long ago that the future belongs to those who have the courage to change their axioms. Does everyone here know who Yitzhak Rabin was?
Yes, he was Oslo Treaty signed. He signed it. He was assassinated.
So for those who say, oh, but there's always been peace there's always been war in Israel and Palestine, that can never end. No. The Oslo Peace Accords in 1993 were arranged at a very historic meeting through Bill Clinton, who helped broker this deal between Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, who was the Prime Minister of Israel, in 1993. That was based upon the principle of the Westphalian system, that through two sovereign governments working on an idea of the common benefits, the common interests of each, that war had to be stopped. And Yitzhak Rabin, who had his major problems in the 70s and 80s, carrying out atrocities against the Palestinians, recognized at a certain point, as you saw from the quote, that his thinking had to change. And as soon as this occurred, LaRouche made the point that the urgent thing here is that we must move with all speed and immediately to get these economic development projects, such as the canal from Gaza to the Dead Sea, going. Because if we wait until we discuss this thing out politically, the enemies of progress and the enemies of the human race, such as Kissinger and his friends, will be successful through people like Sharon's buddies, the other former prime minister, in intervening to drown the agreement in blood and chaos. This is 1993. The development projects which LaRouche was discussing and had been fighting for since the 1970s, along with leading engineers from Israel, from Palestine, were promoted by Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin, as well as Arafat, and began with roads, rail, canals. LaRouche's Oasis Plan was the first example that was highly endorsed by many leading officials at that time, that involved refilling the Dead Sea with desalinated ocean water coming in from the Mediterranean, refilling the aquifers under the Gaza, where currently today you have a huge desperation of, like, literally by 2020 the Gaza won't really be livable if we don't change this because of the contamination of the underground aquifers. And when Yitzhak Rabin had made the request to the World Bank at that period for a $50 billion loan for development, the apparatus of the British Empire was seen in full effect by the conditionalities that no loan provided by the IMF or World Bank would be permitted to go towards anything that would involve dams, electrification, roads, nothing. You could only use the loan for otherwise repaying other usurious debts, as has been the method for many countries around the world. So that, what LaRouche had pointed out is, if people don't on the ground start seeing Earth being moved, if they don't see transformation physically happening to bring in water and get Palestinian and Israeli engineers working together, that all of this would be sabotaged. And indeed, merely 2 years later after this fight, Yitzhak Rabin was indeed assassinated by an agent working for an operation in Israel, and no development had occurred. The idea of forecasting is not something for the gods or for the experts that know all of the right mathematical models, right? The Bernankes and the oracles like the Greenspans, who we're told today are the only ones who are allowed to have authoritative opinions about the future. That is not the case. These people are always wrong, in fact, and what LaRouche has been pointing out is that he's not special, he doesn't have a crystal ball. It's simply that you have to have a sensitivity to the real nature of what human beings are and how we relate as a process to nature, to the biosphere, and how the mind comes to know things about the universe which other animals don't. If you are sensitive to this component, then you can develop insight into processes and act on future states. It's not something that you can be a voyeur about and just make commentaries about, right? Because we're told that, oh, you have to be objective. You can't see yourself. You're subjective. You have emotions. You can't put yourself inside of a process and still speak like an authority. But how could you actually talk about 30,000 African children dying every day of starvation from an objective framework, right? That doesn't work. The idea of justice is intrinsically a part of your analysis. So this is the problem with the current experts. They're really being trained to be voyeurs and have commentaries, but they're not actually trained to change the future. What we're actually doing as an international movement is changing the future. We're intervening into a process and encouraging other people to take on this outlook and method of behavior as well, because it's only potential, for good or for bad. Now, the first parameter, it's not the money. When you're looking at people, the first exercise is really to look at the right parameter. You're not looking at money at all. You're looking at, well, look, you've got an Earth. An Earth has had a certain maybe 4 or 6 billion year experience in a solar system, and in that time, life has arisen on this particular planet. At this point, the current densities of population around the world are as follows. What's in deep red is upwards of 1,000 people per square kilometer, and the lighter and lighter you go, it's less people per square kilometer, right? So then you ask, well, what are the major factors determining that potential, that distribution. Okay, well, obviously, there's the immediate material problem of deserts. What you have there are just the major world deserts. You see the North American desert, you have above India, Saudi Arabia, the Sahara, Australia, some in South America. But certainly you find a correlation, right, between where many of the population centers are not located is going to be over the deserts. Right? Africa, not a lot. Australia here, not a lot. The Middle East, give and take. You do have cases, though, where in deserts, natural deserts like in the west coast of the United States, you do actually find that there are points of great population density, like California. Right. And then you ask, well, okay, well, what allowed that? Why are they different? Why are they not empty? And in fact, they were. Up to 80 years ago, California didn't really have a lot going on there. So, cacti, some cowboys maybe, but you have on top of transcending the material preconditions, you have a higher immaterial process of the powers of cognition, making discoveries, and bringing in to coherence with the needs of future human beings, nature, so that the water that now flows through the Imperial Valley producing great agricultural crops that feed millions and millions of people is an effect of technological advances. The actual idea of what Roosevelt did by bringing in water into that region of the West during the New Deal was an idea of mind over matter, right? You're transforming nature for the sake of the future to meet a real objective need. This is something which the empire is zeroed in on as a direct threat to its existence, because you don't just feed people for the sake of feeding people. You don't just make money with that. You actually make people smarter, and they have a greater sense of self-dignity when they actually build something for the future and they see that their life had meaning, right? So LaRouche is saying here, and he's been really going back to his papers for 40 years, that the effect of mankind in nature is not some fixed relationship where we have to adapt to scarcity. We have to adapt to the deserts, as many people like David Suzuki are telling us we have to do. The problem, the key is that we actually have to always increase the rate of flux density of atoms and minerals flowing through the biosphere, flowing through human society year to year. And if you actually regress on doing that, if you go back in your density, because a population that's very dense is going to require more consumption of water, right? Just imagine all of the water molecules, the food, the ores, the minerals, everything moving through a city that supports 4,000 people per square kilometer like Montreal does. That's going to be much greater than the amount of flux of water and things that you'll find over a period of the Sahara Desert, right? Or a period of civilization 500 years ago, right? When agricultural techniques and the technology were much less advanced. Now, just to show you guys something here that is worthy of a class unto itself, but when you break out of this idea that there's a fixed equilibrium of nature, which people seem to, for some reason or another, believe today a little bit too much, and actually look at these larger cycles of where did the current biosphere come from, what processes brought over the 500 million years of life that we know of on the Earth, what changes occurred, and what's constant in all that change. Well, and this is very difficult probably for people to see. What you have here is a model that goes through two extinction points. You don't simply have a slow aggregation of new species adapting and old ones disappearing over time, nor do you have a constant quantity of living matter on the Earth at all times. In fact, the quantity and density of matter is already, we're finding here, increasing over time. And in that process, you have things like the PT extinction, which you see here, where 96% of the species existent disappear in the fossil records, replaced by a whole new system of life, where up until about 65 million years ago, you have a KT extinction. You guys have heard about the KT extinction, right? Yeah? Yep. So it wasn't just the dinosaurs that disappeared, though. What you had is a whole system of 80% of the flora, fauna, all these species that disappeared with them, to be replaced by a whole new species, system now dominated by mammalian life, fruit-bearing plants, and things which require a denser form of operation, of consumption, of production, which mammals just naturally, we produce and we consume and require a greater degree of metabolic activity than a lizard. This is something which LaRouche has pointed out we see replicated in human society. It's not just in the biosphere that we find this growth, but when we look at human society over the past several thousand years, that when we move, in our metabolism, we have an aspect which is physical, material in our body, but we also have a mental one where we burn different types of matter we find in nature for the sake of work, right? For the sake of sustaining more power to produce food, to transport it, to produce more ideas. From wood to coal to oil to fission to fusion, mankind is the only species that uses fire in a directed way and has the power to always break out of one fixed limited resource when they're being creative to discover something more efficient, more energy dense that allows us to sustain a higher quality and quantity of life. So I'll just throw that out there. Because what is the opposing way the opposing philosophy that's currently being enforced upon Africa as a continental policy, because this oligarchy which is controlling us, they think global. You know, even though people tend to think local, the oligarchy which is trying to manipulate everybody thinks very global. And the only continental policy we see in practice over the past 30 years involved doing the very opposite of what nature actually is showing us it's doing. Instead of actually increasing the density of flow of materials, right, of water, of people, what we actually have is simply the biofuel policy as one example, where every pink country are growing massive amounts of biofuels as demanded by the IMF to receive loans. Everyone here knows what a biofuel is, right? Yeah? So the idea of actually taking corn, sugarcane, food in a world of starvation and burning it for gasoline for the world markets to make for speculators to make money with something while people are starving. This is something which is growing hyperbolically, these policies. So we see every nation that actually has a large portion of green agricultural land below the Sahara are massive growers of biofuel, of food for biofuels. Then the other aspect for the Sahara, what we have is an example of desert tech, where you're actually, this is just to give people a sense of the racist, genocidal policies that are the outgrowth of environmentalism. This program has been now enforced again by the World Bank and IMF to save the environment, just like biofuels, that involve saying, well, look, there's so much light that falls, so much sunlight that falls upon the Sahara. Why don't we just, instead of developing it and greening it, why don't we just cover it with solar panels, with windmills off the coast, and since all of the European countries are supposed to be getting out of carbon fuels and nuclear, right? Because the policy is to destroy all use of nuclear and become carbon neutral as a society, meaning no breathing. All of those countries now need energy. Where are they going to get it? Oh, but you know, all of these North African countries can now ship off that excess green energy into Europe for their consumption. And you can see the complete racism here, right? Because you're not going to, with those energy sources, you are going to be increasing the desert, increasing the heat, which is what having a desert covered with solar panels, it increases the heat, the temperature of that desert by 2 to 3 degrees. So you're going to be increasing the rate of desertification, and you're going to be increasing the rate of stupidification of the people. Because really, if you think about it, you know, what's the knowledge requirements of somebody sustaining a windmill plant, you know? It's literally the intelligence of a squeegee, because you have to go out and squeegee it from all the sand that it gets on it every day. So it's a recolonization of Africa in a more overt way than we've ever seen, with the abrupt policy of depopulation. What are we talking about? What's LaRouche, what's our movement, what are our collaborators talking about when we say increasing the energy flux density of nature. Well, this has been something. When you look at those, again, go back to the objective, what is nature throwing at us, right? We know that nature is very destructive to life and human life. We have things like Hurricane Sandy, which you see up here right now, slamming into the east coast of the USA, Haiti, just a few weeks ago. You have periodic droughts, you have earthquakes. Nature is a violent place. It's not some place you would want to necessarily just adapt to. You know, this is something that you really want to think of as something you want to tame than anything else, but in a responsible way. Now, people like Franklin Roosevelt had openly, explicitly the intention of greening the Sahara Desert. What I'm going to do in my presentation today is just focus on a few components of more advanced development projects for completely greening that Sahara Desert. How do you actually transform it in a way that's lawful? That's something which the empire hates because they can't coexist in a world of development. We have most of these studies I did not come up with myself. These are things that other engineering firms have been struggling for, leaders across Africa have been fighting for decades and decades. Our movement has been promoting many of these things. I'm just going to go through a few of these, and I'll try to do it justice in the limited time I have. And I'm hoping I won't have to skip over too much either. Yeah. So, all right. So let's begin with the southern, or the northern part of or the southern Sahara Desert. A great, perfect example of this problem of deserts can be seen in Lake Tchad. In the country of Chad, you have a lake. In only 30 years, from 1972 to 2007, what you've seen is the shrinkage of this lake, this massive, massive lake, which in 1972 was 26,000 kilometers squared, to today, where it's only about 1,400 kilometers squared. That's a shrinkage of 95%. Now, when you look at the causes online of what's causing this, you'll have the typical hysteria about, oh, this is global warming. This is why we need to put up cover solar panels across Africa even faster. That's, we need to fight it with more food into biofuel faster. People don't often look at the fact that this is not to do with that. This is everything to do with the IMF's policy of cash cropping. That by forcing Chad over these years to isolate itself into exporting one type of wheat, one type of livestock, not actually developing its nation for the consumer markets overseas, obviously you created a condition of advanced attrition, right? Cash cropping is what Avneet was discussing with the opium trade in India. So there's no idea of a full spectrum sovereign economy, of an industrial economy that can be self-sustaining. Cash cropping is the antithesis, where you say every nation does one little thing and the only people who maintain control are the middlemen bankers, the financiers. Right? Consumers can't produce and producers can't consume. This is the core ideological problem of current economic thinking and environmentalist thinking as well. Now, how do you overcome this problem? Well, an Italian firm in 1983 came out with an amazing set of feasibility studies called the TransAqua. The Italian firm, many of the engineers of which and the architect of this policy have been working with our movement, the Schiller Institute in Europe, more recently, and you can see some of their presentations in recent conferences on the LaRouche PAC website. The proposal has been to take, well, what's the problem, right? The physical problem is that you have Lake Chad up here, right? As you see, it's on the border of the Sahara Desert. Then you have this is the Congo region. This whole area here is where there's hundreds and hundreds of rivers, whole rivers that channel water out into it flushes all of the water that rains over this region and that's green. It flushes that into the Atlantic to be evaporated and go through the water cycle. Now, in the Congo, this is a lot of water. This is a huge amount of water. Up here, not a lot of water. And between, there's a 1,500 kilometer distance. So the big question is, how do you move a portion of that water? How do you first collect it, and how do you move it into refilling Lake Chad and creating, as a benefit to the Congo, irrigation land and arable land that you can now grow food on, which currently has swamps that's overflooding, right? And so this was the challenge that Bonifica, the Italian firm, set out to overcome. And their proposal has been to cut out, along this Congo River basin, a 2,400 kilometer canal, which would collect about 5% of that water runoff, which is a lot of water. This 5% is about the equivalent of 2 to 3 Nile rivers. And collect that and channel it up into tributaries that move into Lake Chad, and within a process of about 5 to 15 years, have Lake Chad associated aquifers refilled, and in so doing, you're literally producing an anomaly. I forget the quantity of food. It's something like enough food to feed 120 million people or more immediately when that's done, just by that. But there's other derivatives of this. What you're actually facing is 5.5 to 6 million hectares of irrigable land, and the act of moving water gives you a hydroelectric potential as well, right? As those who have studied the NWAPA proposals that we've been fighting for recognize, 35 gigawatts of electricity would also be developed in moving this water to power the industries, the ports, everything else you would want to have in a modern economy in Chad, Congo, and about 4 million engineers across Africa would have to be trained, and literally, guns would have to be turned into some plowshares here to make this thing happen. Here's another low-res picture of it. The countries affected directly by this project would be Gambia, Congo, Cape Verde, Gambia, Senegal, Chad, Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Upper Volta, Nigeria, Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya directly, and then just by derivative nations, which would benefit by roads, canals, rail, which would have to be developed. You have Cameroon, Central African Republic, and forget the other one, Burundi. So, okay, this is revolutionary, and this has been something which the leading engineer has, and he made the point in a recent presentation that the biggest confrontation he has is, well, people say $40 billion, right? This thing would cost $40 billion. That's so much money. We don't have that. We're bailing out banks. We've only given $27 trillion to Wall Street and European banks. Where are we going to get $40 billion from? We have a fiscal cliff to worry about, don't you know? But you actually look at it, and even Oxfam, they got their problems, but they produced a report looking at what's the cost of wars. How much money have the major African countries below the Sahara paid for weapons, for wars? And in 14 years, $284 billion approximately, that's directly in armaments to kill each other, have been paid for by 23 African countries, which would be the direct beneficiaries of this program. So $284 billion versus $40 billion that would have ended all of these wars. And you think, well, the big thing you do encounter is people say, just like they said for Yitzhak Rabin, well, how are you going to build a big project like that when all these countries that have to so-called work together are busy killing each other, right? The Israelis and the Palestinians can't work on a big project together. They're at war with each other. It'll never happen. Look at Congo. They've got the M23. They're in a civil war. You've got, look at all these surrounding countries. They're all fighting each other. Of course, they don't often realize that you're not going to put your guns down and then build something. It's the act of actually working together and building something that stops the war, as the Peace of Westphalia demonstrated. Abney didn't go through the development plans associated with that 17th century revolution, but you look at that, and it's only through the development of the water, the canals, and the future that you actually achieve a common understanding that we have more in common than what separates us as humans. So this is something that today it still hasn't been begun. Another component of the sub-Saharan region is the Sudan, which has if you look at another nation which is being destabilized directly, it's not just the M23 in Congo that are being created to destabilize and overthrow, but in the Sudan, the Sudan has been a major target for 20 years under President Bashir for destabilization and culling of the population, because essentially the Sudan has made a fight along with Egypt at various times for sovereign development of their resources. Now, what's the problem here? Physically, well, you've got a low population, 30 million. You've got a territory of the third of the United States. Their agricultural potential is on par with the entire agricultural production of North America. It's a little bit less. But of this entire potential of irrigable land, only 3% of that is, less than that actually, 2 million square acres, 2 million square acres are actually being used in the Sudan for food. However, of the entire irrigable land, 200 million acres exist now as a potential, right? Without any revolutionary water projects or anything, that's what currently exists if you chose to actually do that. So 200 million could be produced. Okay, but of that 2 million square acres, that's a redundancy, 2 million acres, no, it's 2 million acres. But of that, 70% of it goes to waste because there's just no infrastructure, there's no way to actually get the food to the marketplace, so a lot of this goes to waste by bacteria, just rot. Yes, oui, absolument.
Les pays, c'est quoi le pays le plus qui produit les figues, tout ça, et comme un peu, je veux dire, les tables, tout ça, oui, ce sont les pays arabes. Ceux qui produisent des figues, si vous connaissez ça, ce sont la Grèce et les pays arabes, ça?
Les figues, je ne sais pas. Mais je sais que beaucoup des productions de nourriture qu'on trouve dans les pays abusés par la FMI, ils exportent pour les marchés spécialisés, comme les fraises de Tunisie qui sont mangées en Europe. Mais c'est pas trop souvent qu'on voit que ces nations qui produisent ont le droit de consommer eux-mêmes aussi. And that's the big problem. What I was just saying was that for those countries, because he was asking where do the figs come from, I don't know.
Yeah. Et après ça, dès un de ces jours, même plus tard des années plus tard, que les guerres seront finies, tout ça dans le Moyen-Orient, tout ça aussi, là, après ça, il y aura un développement de production assez développé qui va s'agrandir sur la production alimentaire, tout ça, sur le biologique, tout ça, des choses comme ça.
We have to double world food production fast. That's right. You have to. Tu dois doubler la production de nourriture mondiale vite. On n'a pas trop de temps. Et en faisant ça, on va être capable de transformer l'économie à quelque chose de juste et moral. Mais ça prend une conception de l'être humain pour mobiliser la créativité nécessaire pour arrêter l'empire global qui veut écraser le développement et pour faire le job de doubler la production et d'enseigner la population de comment le faire eux-mêmes.
Pour le développement, qu'il y ait plus de richesse, tout ça, sur l'ingénierie.
Yeah.
C'est ça en français comme vous dites?
Yeah, you have to educate everybody. Mass education. This small area is what we currently have as food, which has been called the Gezira farmlands in Sudan. This is the Blue Nile, this is the White Nile, and this is the Nile as a whole, the longest river system in the world. And this is what's been completed in 1958. Since then, not a lot has been permitted to develop, not very much. We have had developments where, under Bashir in 1993, the Sudan did become food self-sufficient with current policies that stuck it to the IMF, but there's been a struggle. And now with Tony Blair as heading up the economic policies as the Sudan advisor, this is obviously crashing down pretty fast. But the fight is still on. This is what I was telling you about the 200 million acres potential. This is just right there. Like literally this would be completely blossoming with arable land, forestry, you have 200 million acres of food, 200 million acres also of forestry that could be developed if you chose to use these water resources in a normal way, and $57 million for pasture alone, acres. So this is okay. This is just what we're dealing with there. So this is sub-Saharan. Now we're going to begin to move into okay, one other aspect actually. To make this, to accelerate this, the biggest project that we've seen in this area has been the Jonglei Canal. This is Egypt, Libya is over there, Tchad, Sudan. The Jonglei Canal is something which flows on the White Nile, which goes through these major swamplands. As you see here, it says it's partially dug. It's partially dug because 70% of it was finished. It was begun in 1978. It was finished it was stopped in 1984 when civil war broke out with the Sudanese Liberation Army, sponsored by the British to destabilize the Sudan in civil war. And this massive behemoth, this is the biggest digging machine in history. It's huge. It's like, got it written down here. It's 2,100 tons, capable of digging 2 kilometers per week at 3 shifts alternating, right? 8 hours a pop. Its name is Sarah, dubbed Sarah. And poor Sarah has been completely abused and neglected, used primarily for target practice by militias in Sudan for 20 years. It was brought in by a French firm. After, literally, I mean, you've got a small little stretch, and if this were finished, the entire Sud swamp area would be reduced by 35%. And that swamp will be turned into, just like the Tennessee Valley Authority under Roosevelt, it would be completely, producing food. All right, so these are 2 areas. You've got this major potential here in the Sudan. You've got the Lake Chad. Oh. And now let's move just to a couple of projects in North Africa, right? Where for about, literally, I mean, we're talking over 100 years, architects and engineers have been looking at this little water depression here, this lake. It doesn't exist. Today there is no water in this lake. It's called the Katara Depression. And simply by taking well there is, but there's a little bit of salt water. It's not really much. But by cutting through 35 kilometers, you could fill this thing up with water from the Mediterranean and blossom that region. Now this is the big thing. With the southern sub-Saharan countries, the problem is mismanagement of the natural water resources, right? Opposite problem exists in the North Africa. It's where do you create those resources, right? They don't exist. So it's a twofold problem. Egypt, well, their population, you've got like 80 million people. They all live on about 5 to 7% of the landmass, right? All congealed around the Nile. So that most of Egypt is completely uninhabited. This is why you need development. You need more people in these areas. And the Qatar Depression is about the size of 2 Lebanons, 19,600 kilometers squared. German planning firms have estimated that 2.7 billion kilowatts of power per year could be developed by bringing this water in. And this region would blossom. So you've already got taken on the desert here pretty heavily. The other component is the root air. You can't really see it. I didn't have an adequate picture, and I wish I did, so you'll have to just imagine it. What you see here is Tunisia and Algeria. You guys see that little patch of green? Right. There's 3 similar depressions up here. Since about 5,000 years ago, you had a lot of water over the Sahara. That has since flushed. It's now not over the Sahara anymore. But you have relics, echoes of this, with the salt flats underneath the desert, and you have little depressions all over the place that were formerly vast canals. Now this calls for doing something similar. A French engineer named François Rouder in 1874 put out the first feasibility study to bring that water in, flush it, and he called for cooling down the climate, because whenever you have any area that has a lot of green naturally has more evapotranspiration, right? More precipitation naturally happens because more cloud coverage forms over the green areas than over a desert. Not a lot of clouds in the desert. And this means a cooling naturally happens. And the water itself, life has what we've noticed is a self-directed, developing property to it. Life makes more life. Deserts don't just grow against life. Life actually does take over deserts organically if you give it the right impetus. This region here that François Roudert came out with, these are called the Tchad depressions in Algeria and Tunisia. Tchad, yeah. And this calls for taking 400 kilometers of water motion from the Gulf of Gabes in Algeria to the canals throughout Tunisia. And it's 240 kilometers of canals. This was backed by the engineer who was the designer of the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal. Right, so this guy, Ferdinand de Lesseps, who designed both the Suez and the Panama, also backed this thing full-heartedly. This would completely work. The big problem, obviously, is salt water, right? Because we know that salt water is not always conducive to living things. There's ways around that. One aspect, immediately, just in terms of there are certain types of crops we can choose to selectively breed in regions like what are called halophytes. Halophytes are a form of plant which it thrives, it likes salt water. So you can grow certain types of plants using salt water. They've even crossbred certain aspects of the halophyte with rice, and have found that they were able to actually grow rice in desert regions using salt water. So this is part of the Green Revolution. There's other things that can be tried, but obviously you'd want to use certain things like eucalyptus, palm trees, things that can thrive off of a dry climate at first. But the second more important component relevant to educating everybody, like really increasing this energy flux density of society and of mankind and of nature, is nuclear power. Russia has begun producing small, portable, floating, modular nuclear power plants, which could easily be set up off the coast of the Mediterranean to desalinate this ocean water en masse and bring it into these depressions. So you have fresh water that could cleanse out any remaining salt that exists in those depressions, and then just let that thing just take over, let it just blossom. Little mini power plants could also, these things would give immediate industrial output for the new industries, trains, transportation, other things that you would want to have in Africa. So these things exist. The technology is there for doing such things. The problem is the gods of Olympus have said no technology for the poor people, right? Fire is banned from the mortals. So that has to be overcome with Glass-Steagall, with the institution of a credit system. Can we just, 2 seconds? I'm wrapping up, and then we can, I'm wrapping up. All right, so these are just a few projects now. For the sake of time, I'm gonna begin to phase out of this part, but we will look at one thing that I didn't address yet also, because you could take water from either moving it from one place that has a lot to one place that doesn't have a lot, right? If you want to think about how do you create water, you could desalinate it like we were discussing, take salt water, make it fresh. Or Africa's secret weapon is underground water. Most of the water that we currently have that's fresh is located underground. And Africa is blessed with some of the greatest abundances of underground lakes, rivers, anywhere in the world. And as you see, the driest place of the world, of the Sahara, is ironically also the most dense in underground water. This is called the Nubian aquifers. And it's astounding. New discoveries are coming out every day, just discovering more pockets of lakes and things that are... Sudan alone, northern Sudan has a lake the size of Lake Erie, fresh water underneath it. All it needs to be is just tapped, and you can take that, it's not just the southern part of the Sudan that has to blossom, the north could blossom as well if you start doing this. And as one of our members in Europe made the point, is that people say, well, you can't do this. You can't do that because this underground water is for the future generations. We don't want to take away from the future generations, but then the point he made is, well, that's a fallacy, because we are future generations from those who came before us. So, and he makes the point, Hussein Askari, that, well, what we're going to leave for future generations are not deserts, right? That's the gifts we give to them. We don't give them little unusable gifts it's like a kid not allowed to open up the toy that they get, you know? It's like, oh, awesome, but you're not allowed to open it. It's a collector's item. No, that's not the point. I don't want it to mean the greening of a desert with a toy, but still. This has begun to be tapped. Gaddafi has done very interesting things, actually, over the 80s and 90s with what's called the Great Man-Made River in Libya that taps into these aquifers. And it was begun in '84, the same year that the Jonglei Canal was sabotaged. This was begun. And in total, it has built thus far 2,820 kilometers of all sorts of pipes and aqueducts under the desert, bringing this water up into Libya. This is a certain overview of it. There's a lot more, using this very specific type of circular planting of crops. And you just move, each one's divided into like 8 segments, and you just need to move them season to season so that you give the ground a chance to replenish. The problem is, so far, as far as most engineers have commented on this, is that it hasn't directly been designed to permanently transform the desert. It's been more designed to meet the requirements of your immediate population, exports, but and also coastal cities. It hasn't really been benefiting the interior of Libya so much. So that would have to change. Why is this war so likely? And people really have to recognize that there is a battle of two ideologies coming to clash right now. And it's not just East versus West or red versus blue. It's that you have Russia, China, India, hell, most of the countries representing the majority of the world population concentrated in the East, Africa, South America, that they want development. Because they know that the choices when you're faced with a limitation to your population, you could either reduce your population, or you can educate your population and change nature to increase the bounty of nature for a growing population. You can do one of the two. You can't stay fixed. There's no equilibrium. And so these nations who have been resisting the war drive have also been positively making the type of offers and projects economically with Africa and Southeast Asia that the West hasn't made since John F. Kennedy was killed. So these are just a brief layout of the various hydroelectric dams and water projects being built with the help of China in Africa. Every single dot is a hydro plant. In the Sudan, as an example of the method that China, because people often say, oh, but China, they just help for their own self-interest, And it's like, yeah, for sure, they help for their own self-interest. It's in your interest not to have neighbors killing each other and to have educated neighbors who can eat, And yeah, there might be some unjust dealings, but whatever. The point is you're actually doing things that are going to benefit those countries in real ways. 5,000 Sudanese engineers were actually trained by China to build this major dam that was finished in 2007. As an example, we haven't done anything like that since Eisenhower, actually training people in a poor country to do something themselves. The method of the IMF and World Bank has been send in Monsanto's people or BP oil, Don't allow people in the poor country to actually make use of anything you do, for God's sakes. They might become sovereign. Rail, it's astounding. I mean, the quantity of rail projects, all of which China has been building throughout almost every country in Africa, that involve opening up corridors for new potential development. They have, unlike the British colonial history in Africa, which has created a sea of these tiny little rail lines all around the perimeter. When you look at what Britain has done, you find these little tiny worms all along the coasts to mines, never having common gauge. So there's no potential to actually connect any part of Africa with itself, right? Because the British had thought this through. So unlike that, you have common gauges being used with the potential and the intention to unite Africa as a one Africa with the help of a lot of these Chinese firms. So you can see why China is such a threat existentially to the existence of empire. So Okay, weakened green deserts. There's similar projects that you guys, I encourage everyone here to watch on our Schiller Institute website, and on the CRC website, Committee Republic Canada, that go through the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, I mean, the world, we've got it covered. Engineers, there's hundreds of thousands of engineers ready to go and move on this stuff. It has to be seen in the context of what LaRouche has called the world land bridge, that starts with the connection between Russia and this continent to Alaska, Canada, the connection of the Panama Canal through into South America, and through Saudi Arabia and the Middle East into Africa. You can connect the entire world by overland high-speed magnetic levitation rail. It's much less expensive to do this than it is to bail out a bunch of bankrupt zombie banks by far. And the idea is the future needs it. If you don't do this, the population is going to collapse into a dark age. The phenomenon driving hurricanes will be stymied. For people who remember that first picture of Hurricane Sandy slamming into the East Coast, remember? Hurricanes that slam into the East Coast happen because directly of the Sahara Desert. Whenever you have a very hot region that's dry with a very cold, wet region right next to each other, that differential creates a jet stream, and the Sahara is the direct cause of every single hurricane that slams into the east coast of the United States. So by greening that region and cooling down and stopping the differential, all of a sudden mankind is actually regulating nature to stop destroying more nature and people. So the Earth is not the only place where these things start. Droughts, hurricanes, earthquakes. Yes, there are factors on the Earth, but we have to look, especially if we're thinking about the permanent and continual immortal survival of the species, we have to look at the factors that pre-exist the Earth, that are actually higher and even more important in many ways in driving these processes of what causes deserts, what causes ice ages. Well, and to do that, we all have to begin to look at the role of our solar system, right? And our solar system is giving us the greatest clues right now that we are spending way too much time looking at balancing diminishing returns and our momentary pleasures, and not looking enough at creating new resources and doing things that are in the common interest of mankind. Russia and China have policies that have looked at, well, let's say one thing. Before I actually say Russia and China, on December 12th, we almost got nicked by something big. I don't know if you people heard. Because in terms of threats from nature, and I include the galaxy as part of nature, we're not going into a Mayan 2012 thing, so don't get your hopes up here or anything freaky. But this is something very important. No, not yet. Where is it still playing? No, I stopped it. December 12th in the morning. Oh, forgive the, we don't need this sounds here. All right, what you have here. Yeah, let me hear this sounds. Okay, this is an asteroid 2012 XE54. That's the Earth, that's the asteroid. On December 12th in the morning, a 3-kilometer asteroid flew between the moon and the Earth. I forget the distance, but between the Earth and the moon is still close enough for me. 3 million miles, okay, sure. So, 400,000 total? So it wouldn't be 3 million, it would be less than if it flew between the two. Right. So, in that case, it would be less than 3 million, whatever it is, I'm not too sure. But the point is, 3 kilometers that's an extinction maker. That's they hypothesize that the thing that eliminated the dinosaurs was something probably around that, 3 to 6.
3 kilometers is a lot of mass, there's a lot of gravitational.
Yes.
So you think the
Yeah, right. So what we're facing is if we know that these things will objectively hit us. We know that just look at the fossil records, looking at the environment in which the greater biotic environment is located in our little neighborhood of the galaxy, guaranteed asteroids hit all the time. Big ones also hit periodically. And it's in all of our self-interest. I don't care how rich you are, or how poor you are, or what color you are, or what anything. It is in your interest to understand the processes that go into making this happen, and then thinking about how do we actually deal with this in a way that we have thought about dealing with deserts. So the following presentation was produced by our LPAC research team in the United States, introducing people to this aspect, looking at how the only nation which has produced a proposal to deal with this objective threat is Russia, directly as a nation, which has called through the, I think they actually go through it, so I won't say more than that, because I believe this video might actually go through the political aspect of this. If it doesn't, I can do that. Or brief questions which anyone would like to throw out before Dave transitions into his piece? Yeah.
Why don't you use solar power to desalinate water?
Because of the energy density of the power of solar panel is what's called a low energy flux density. The heat quality is of a low density such that you can't do the power to vaporize the water sufficiently and separate it from the salt in the reverse osmosis, which is necessary. Because you have to heat it up, so you have to vaporize it, and then the salt falls to the bottom, and then you collect the vaporized water, and it becomes water again. The amount of water that's required and the heat densities are too high for solar panels or windmills to do the job. So you have to go to, like right now, most of the solar panels are made, most of the desalination plants, there's about 15,000, are made with natural gas and coal and things like that, which is not efficient either. It's more efficient density-wise than wind or solar, but it's also limited. You don't want to stick with that shit anymore. But the nuclear is the only option to get into this domain where we have to think not only about greening deserts, but also if we're going to deal with asteroid threats, you can't do that with a solar or wind power economy. You need high density energies to deflect the orbits of these things.
See, that would be nuclear. Wouldn't it be fun to have all of our nuclear weapons pointed at asteroids?
Instead of at each other, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Get rid of them all.
Yeah, right. Yeah.